Hi, morning everyone. So today we're going to consider some very significant and very interesting aspects to the novel that we've not yet explored, and these are going to help you in your writing about the novel and in pulling out some of the bigger issues that you could apply to paper 2 exam questions in the future. So some of the things I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to let you go and investigate a bit further, will be the context, so the historical context. I know we've already thought a little bit about it, and some of you have done presentations on it. So I'm going to bring back some of those details just so that we understand where we're building from. I'm going to also talk about, so when I say the wider context, we're obviously historically all the way back to the 16th century with the invasion of the Spanish and the colonization. I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about what was called the Latin American boom, which was a generic phrase referring to a group of writers from Latin America around the time of Chronicle. We're also going to consider like the significance of this, like how does this impact? Because, you know, we can use phrases like post-colonialist lens as a critical theory through which to look at the novel, but we need to be sure about what we're basing our facts on. And also we're going to think about how the historical context of slavery, for example, has had an impact on the Latin American boom and as a consequence on Chronicle as well. So considering what significance magical realism has, and it's quite controversial because it's debated, it's widely debated. So is magical realism important here? And if it is, what is Gabriel García Márquez, or Gabo as he was known to his friends, trying to get us to consider? Okay, so those are the three things that I just want to talk about right now. These will be significant in you considering the novel from different perspectives. And also trying to apply different critical theories to the novel in your own writing. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a few ideas about the background. Now, so in the 1500s, Spain colonized Colombia, and this was part of a huge effort to colonize Latin America. So on this version of the world map, you've got Europe in the center, and you can see that they went all the way from Spain to Colombia in the northwest coast of South America. Now, this was a huge part in the colonization of Colombia. If we think about what the Spanish would have found at the time, there were indigenous Indian tribes, such as the Torona Indians, and over a long period of time, these tribes were colonized. The country was introduced to Spanish. It wasn't really a country at the time. It was kind of lots of different states. But so the Spanish language was introduced. Now, there are still many, many, many languages spoken in Colombia. A lot of indigenous Indian languages are still spoken, but Spanish is the main language. And during that time, it was the time of the Atlantic slave trade. So Latin America was the main destination for millions of African slaves that were transported to these Spanish colonies. And they would have probably been made to work on many things, not only building the infrastructure of the towns, and indeed I've shown you pictures of Colombia and Cartagena, where I used to live, where you can clearly see the influence of Spanish colonialism. You can see the buildings are very European in style. They have lots of balconies, columns, courtyards, and this is very significant. Okay, so what actually happened in Colombia is that you've got then kind of this Afro-Latino population, particularly because areas like Sucre, now the town is not actually given anywhere in the novel. We know actually from later that this is the town, I think it's called Arataca or something like that. It's where Gabriel García Márquez grew up. And so this was his town where it's set, but he doesn't actually give the name of the town anywhere in the novella. Now, this area would have been, it was on the coast, it would have been, there would have still been many, and indeed there still are, kind of many hints of the slave trade of the past, not only from looking at the very multicultural population, Afro-Caribbean, you've got the kind of descendants of Indian, the descendants of the Spanish, and it's a huge kind of melting pot with people from very pale skin to very dark skin, and it's, yeah, and Spanish is the main language, okay? So that kind of gives you an idea. Now, with that, particularly from what I saw when I was in Colombia, there's lots of talk about skin colour and jokes about skin colour and jokes in the way that people would call you. If you've got kind of what I would call to be quite brunette, dark hair, but you've got pale skin, then they call you blondie. It's kind of strange. So there's like lots of different ways that people differentiate between each other, but culturally it's very, very significant, the background of where you're from and your level in society as such. So if for example you look like you are Spanish or have paler skin, then chances are that your descendants would have been Spanish, hence you have a higher status in society. And vice versa, the Afro-Caribbean influence, the Afro-Latino population would also be considered kind of lower class. And so we could apply both post-colonialist theory here, of course the slave trade, but we've also got, you know, this very marked difference in society. So women, for example, women are very much considered property or second-class citizens, particularly in the novella. Okay, so that's a little bit about the history, the historical context and how it impacts on the novel. Now moving on to what is known as the Latin
American boom.
Now, I'm just going to see if I can... I'm just going to see if I can find something that I was looking for. No. Okay, so what do we mean by the Latin boom? Well, obviously, you know, Spain went through many... I mean Colombia. Colombia went through a huge change in gaining independence. Independence happened around, I think it was like the late 1800s. So we're talking about finally it becoming its own country and trying to cast off and reject the past, the colonizers, the Spanish influence. At the same time, it's, you know, there's so many, culturally, so many things that are very similar to Spain, and the language is obviously the most obvious of those. But you've got around like the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, there was a literary movement of mostly male, young Latino novelists. And these came from lots of different countries around Latin America, but they seem to have certain generic conventions to their work. So it was a movement where they kind of adopted particular ideas. And this movement was a drive towards creating their own identity as Spanish-speaking novelists away from Spain, and trying to define exactly what is meant by Latin American culture and what is so different about it. One of the interesting things is, and you will see this because I'm going to give you a couple of resources to look at. One of the interesting things that I will pick out now is that it was considered a move away from the colonizers. Now, the colonizers were imposers of structure, essentially, this kind of structure on society. And with that, we've got, like, for example, if we think about, you know, Hollywood, or we think about the US, and we think about classic Hollywood editing and the classic plot line, you know, we've got the rising action, we've got the climax, we've got the falling action. All of these things contribute towards a very stylized, formulaic way of telling stories, and they've become the accepted structure of telling stories over the years. And one thing that during the Latin American boom that novelists did was they kind of rejected this structure, and this could be seen as an attempt to kind of cast off the shackles of the slavery, of the colonization of the past. And indeed we see this in Chronicle. You know, the very complicated structure of telling the story is very, very significant, because it leads us not to focus on the killing itself, but to focus on other aspects. It leads us to focus on, you know, how did it take place? What led to this? It leads us as a reader to ask questions about, you know, why did this person not manage to warn Santiago? What kind of restrictions in society meant that that the message didn't get across? And we started looking at that a little bit yesterday when we were considering different characters in chapter 3 and why they didn't manage to warn, particularly the women, why they didn't manage to warn Santiago. He wasn't warned in the end. And something that I think we'll look at a little bit more, and probably this will be a bit more significant today, is the idea of class division and indeed slavery, and understanding the levels in society according to, you know, who would have been a descendant of a slave, for example. These are the kind of the servants and the ones that are really just almost objectified, used as sexual objects by their masters. And so we still see, even though slavery, of course, didn't exist in the 20th century, it was already abolished, but we still see the those kind of colonial structures in society, i.e., you know, the masters taking advantage of the poorer people, and indeed the women. Okay, so Latin American boom. This was the quest for these Latin American writers to find their own identity as Spanish writers. And one of the things I've just mentioned was the narrative structure. Other things were the kind of way that they used to tell a story, and this brings me to my third point, which is magical realism. Now, it's debatable to what extent magical realism is evident in Chronicle. Certainly, there's no debate about it in other of Gabriel García Márquez's novels, such as Love in the Time of Cholera, Chronicle of a Death 100 Years of Solitude. So these are well known to be magical realist novels, and actually he did write this towards the end of this Latin American boom. So, you know, it's kind of on the border, and indeed, you know, he makes comment himself that, you know, this isn't exactly, magical realism in the way that it's made up. It's not. This is things that actually happened. And there's two main ideas that you're going to read in the essay. And one of the ideas is that magical realism is a reporting of the kinds of almost crazy things that happen in society. And I can attest to that. I mean, having lived in Colombia, particularly at the age of 22, it was a real eye-opener. I mean, things used to happen that you think, wow, like that doesn't happen everywhere. These kind of things are not normal. And so certainly, like, obviously with the honor killing that happens in the novel, we can see reflections of this happening in other societies, but it's almost like it's a catastrophic kind of chain of events which lead to this, and it's almost like, so many things could have happened to stop this, and yet it happened. So it's so many little chinks in the chain, coincidences, and I mean, even like Romeo and Juliet, taking influences from like Shakespeare, you've got like the message doesn't get through and it leads to the tragedy of the two young lovers killing themselves. Well, it's almost the same here. It's almost as if the Vicario brothers give the community itself every opportunity to stop this murder, whether they do it consciously or not. And yet the community fails to stop it. And this is one of the things that Gabriel García Márquez tries to bring out, is like, obviously this idea of honor is very important, and this idea of social responsibility is very important. But all these things come together as a culture to make the setting of the novel. Now, in terms of magical realism, of course, we've got the dreams. That's very significant. The dreams and the reality is something which is well known in magical realism. But what is interesting about magical realism is that, again, it seems to be some kind of implanting of identity. So this identity that, yes, South America or Latin America is so very different to the kind of linear structure, for example, of the US. And so when you listen to the TED Talk, you'll see that, that it's very much linked to this idea of globalization, the idea that, that we've got this kind of homogeneity that is being supplanted on us all, not only through social media, but through the ages. And we can see that through the Coca-Cola advertisements that you're studying, for example. So this is the effect of a superior power trying to implant kind of this cultural imperialism. And the magical realism is very much a move away from this. And the magical realism is like these kind of situations that are almost humorous that happen to people. And as Gabo himself says, this is actually, these are the kind of things that actually do happen. So it is stylized, but at the same time, it creates this a deeper connection with spirituality, with the soul, with the higher powers, with superstition. People in Colombia, when I lived there, used to talk quite a lot about witches. And when I say witches, they would believe that they were, I think it was more like kind of, as you would imagine, shamans in the jungle, as part of a tribe, for example. So they would talk about white witches, and they would talk about even going to see white witches. And so many people I spoke to would be like, oh yeah, I had this problem with my ex-boyfriend, blah, blah, blah. And then I went and saw a white witch and they gave me this potion. And I was like, okay, interesting. So like, there's so many kind of deeper, wider levels and kind of weirdness, actually, when you listen to the TED Talk, you realize. Okay, so you want to think about exploring the novel from these angles. You want to think about how does the impact of colonialism change the way that writers wanted to express themselves? How do they forge an identity through magical realism? Even though we may consider Chronicle to be not as magical realist as some of his other novels, it's certainly got elements of that, and there's no mistaking this kind of Latin American feel, and this attempt by Gabriel García Márquez, as you will read in the essay, to question, to explore magical realism, but to use it as a way of questioning social justice. So how does he use it to consider things like slavery, honor killings? So he's using it to protest against these major and very significant aspects of social behavior or history. Okay, so the essay that I've given you to read, it's actually really good. It's just having a look at it here now. It looks at the whole thing through obviously a post-colonial lens and what's called a new historicism. So I think this could help if we're applying the new and the old. For example, say you get a question about something that you could relate to the new and the old, or changes over time, or the application of this novel over time, then it's something which I think that you will find useful in considering this idea of globalization and this kind of rejection of the colonial powers finally. And of course, not to forget feminism and everything that we were talking about yesterday. So while you will not be able to use all of this in a paper too, I think there's definitely elements of it that will help to reinforce your argument, that'll help you to show that you've got knowledge and understanding. And actually, I think hopefully today you will come away from today's lesson with just a renewed vigour for this fantastic novel. And when you start to appreciate some of the conventions that have gone into the writing, you'll understand, hopefully appreciate more about this novel, and you will be able to then transmit that through your writing. Okay, so thank you, and that's all.